Pınar Bilgin from Bilkent University. My co-editor Gülşah Çapan from Erfurt University is also with us. We are here today to present our special issue for the journal International Relations, issued by Turkey's International Relations Council. The founder and longtime editor of the journal, Mustafa Aydın Hoca, is also here with us from Kadir Has University. We're grateful for the opportunity to prepare this global IR, Globalizing IR special issue for the journal. Gülşah is going to chair the first half of this session, and then I'm going to take over since she has to go and teach afterwards. So I'm going to take over as chair later. But Gülşah, I'm going to take it over from me. Yeah, thank you.
Yep. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. As was mentioned, this is a sort of discussion around the special issue that was prepared for Uluslararası İlişkiler Dergisi. And before I start the sort of chairing duties, I want to give a short introduction to the special issue, to the background and logic behind it. And one of the things I want to underline with respect to that is that as we will discuss here as well, we didn't start off with a specific definition of what global IR means, but rather left it as this process that we can all openly discuss. What does globalizing IR entail, and what does it mean for different people? But one of the things that we underlined in the introduction to the special issue was that there are two main challenges into how we discuss globalizing IR. And how we respond to those challenges actually structures our definition of what we think global IR is. So one of the things to always keep in mind is that we might all be saying global IR, but we might also be referring to different dynamics and relations. And the two challenges that we identified were the first one being the problem of Eurocentrism as a system of knowledge. And the other one was problem of reification. The problem of Eurocentrism as a system of knowledge refers to not approaching Eurocentrism as an issue of geography or location, right? It's not about which location you're from necessarily, but more of an epistemic issue, right? About how a system of knowledge has constructed Europe as a separate place that is also temporally ahead of the spaces that were identified as being non-Europe. Approaching it as an epistemic issue means approaching it as an issue of knowledge, right? Problematizing knowledge systems itself, rather than sort of locations. In the way that we've sort of outlined it, Eurocentrism constricts our understanding of the international, not because non-Europe is missing, but that it is incorporated in a particular way that overlooks non-Europe's quote-unquote contributions, right? So it's not necessarily that if we rectify the absence of non-Europe, the problem of Eurocentrism will magically sort of disappear. The second challenge that we identified was the challenge of reification. And there are two dynamics here that we discuss in the introduction. The first one is the amount of forgetting that goes into reifying a particular narrative about how the world works into IR theory. And the example we talk about is how sovereignty in Europe, in our narratives, turns into sovereignty as a thing, right? So the point to underline there is that it's not that sovereignty as a thing does not capture non-Europe. It's that sovereignty as a thing does not even capture European experiences, right? And that's one aspect of reification to keep in mind. The second aspect of it is the reification of West and non-West, and how we sort of attribute characteristics to them, whereby the spiritual non-West is pitted against the rational West. So the agenda we try to identify is about not about retrieving the authentic subject, but rather questioning our understandings of authenticity, spirituality, rationality, right? And the sort of challenges that remain in front of us, I think whichever strand you might be more close to continues, whether it's different thought traditions, which is how to retrieve the subject without reifying it, how to construct narratives without falling into historiographical traps, and how to make different archives of knowledge visible into our narratives of international relations. I'll sort of conclude the introduction here and say that we will go in the order of the program, whereby contributors will present their articles for 7 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. And after the first round of questions, I think each participant will have 3-4 minutes to reply to them, and then hopefully there will be another round after that. As was mentioned, I am very strict about timing, and I have to. Here you see 3 minutes, and this is your first warning, and then you will get 1 minute, right? And that's when you know you have to sort of wrap it up. I think based on the program, our first speaker is Professor Bilgin from Bilkent University. Hocam.
Okay. Thank you. I'm alphabetically privileged, so I go first here. Even David has to follow me in this case, Blaney coming after Bilgin. Thank you, Gülşah. Thank you, everyone, for being with us, both our fellow contributors, our hosts, as well as our audience. I'm going to talk about, as Gülşah said, about my contribution to this special issue, which is entitled How Not to Globalize International Relations. I've shared the link to the special issue, and I'll do it in a moment's time for those who are joining us later. Now, efforts toward globalizing IR are not new. I've been involved in such efforts since 2004. Some of us have been at it even longer. Some in our audience may have recently heard about them, but we have long histories of involvement in discussions and explorations of the limitations of international relations. I came to these discussions in a tangential manner through critical security studies. It has over the years become more central to my work, as I noticed that I can't really further my work on critical security studies without inquiring into the ethnocentric, Eurocentric, parochial limitations of international relations. So my contribution to the special issue, it reflects on one of the ways in which we have gone about globalizing international relations. And in the article, I begin with the observation that the notions of center and periphery have increasingly been adopted to highlight structural inequalities in the production of knowledge about international relations, in structural inequalities between Western Europe and North America on the one hand, and the rest of the world on the other. And at the first instance, raising awareness regarding these structural inequalities and encouraging us to look beyond the privilege center looks like a fitting response to address Eurocentrism in international relations, right? Asking those who do not seem to have a voice, so what do you think about X, Y, and Z? Right. So why is it that I'm picking a fight with scholars who seem to be fighting the good fight? Why am I asking this question? The answer is because of the implication, right? If we're seeking the periphery's perspective only now, right, that's seemingly the case, then presumably it was not present in the constitution of the international if we're turning to some others and asking them, so what do you think? The implication is that they were not there in the beginning. So we are only now asking them, so what do you think about this? Here it is important to remember that here I make a distinction in the early on in the article, right? The distinction between being left out of prevalent narratives about world politics, the stories that we tell ourselves in international relations, right? This is not the same as being outside the dynamics that have constituted the international, right? Absence from narratives about the international on the one hand, right? Absence from the international on the other. They're not the same thing, although one has important consequences for the other, right? So the periphery is outside by virtue of being left out of those narratives that the center tells about the international, the stories that we tell ourselves outside, but it is also constitutive of the international that these ideas, practices, institutions that are typically ascribed to the center have been co-constituted by center and periphery together. And in developing this argument, I draw on Stuart Hall on the one hand, cultural theorist, and Blanian and Ayatollah, David here with us, his work on the notion of constitutive international. And I distinguish between three types of constitutive relations. One is in terms of the periphery providing bodies and lands whose labor and riches were usurped by the center, right? This is the most known relationship between the center and the periphery, the material riches being usurped by the center argument. The second kind of constitutive dynamic is this periphery being an other to center's self, right? The periphery being an other to center's self. One is material dynamics, material exploitation. The second is self-other relations. The third one is the periphery as thinking actors who have also shaped ideas, practices, and institutions of their own and those of the center, right? Material exploitation, self-other relations, and the periphery as thinking actors who have been present at the constitution of the international, right? I note that decentering approaches capture the first and the second, the exploitative relationship and self-other dynamic, but they overlook the co-constitutive dynamics behind the ideas, practices, and institutions of both the center and the periphery. Furthermore, I suggest, either directly or by implication, these approaches typically portray those ideas, practices, and institutions as having autonomously developed, right? So my argument then is it is by virtue of overlooking the periphery as constitutive of those ideas, practices, institutions, that decentering approaches have allowed for totalizing notions of the international to remain unscathed, right? Not necessarily on purpose, but in terms of the implications of the argument. This is, I think, a far cry from the efforts of dependency school, world systems scholarship, or Galtungian peace research, all three bodies of work that utilize the notions of center and periphery as they seek to move away from totalizing conceptions of the international. All three bodies of work highlight different experiences of those at the center and those on the periphery, and underscore the structural connections in between. The dissimilar experiences do not come about autonomously, right? Dissimilar experiences do not come about autonomously. What is more, all these three bodies of research have highlighted, but did not always explore in greater detail, that the ways in which such co-constitution is not isolated to exploitation of resources, material resources, or self-other dynamics, but also comprise learning, be it practices, institutions such as the development of underdevelopment or cultural violence. One of them, Galtungian peace research, the other is more of the dependency school argument, right? So it is such connectedness between center and periphery's experiences that is overlooked in the literature that I'm problematizing here. And finally, just to conclude, this literature actually is in good company in that regard, in terms of that particular issue that I'm problematizing, because Rob Walker's discussion on the double outsides of the international, I think, has the same limitations. While the periphery's outside status is lamented in that scholarship, a solution is sought again in asking, so what do you think about X, Y, and Z? What is missing, then I argue, is an understanding of the periphery as constitutive not only by providing bodies and lands whose labor and riches are usurped, the first kind, right? Not only as an other to oneself, the second kind, but also as thinking actors who've been part of what Sankaran Krishna has referred to as the intimate dialogue between Western and non-Western economies, societies, and philosophies, unquote. So such dialogue then is not only about othering dynamics or exploitation materially, but also comprises centuries of learning that one can't really no longer can boldly claim the ownership of X, Y, and Z. I'm going to stop here, Gülşah. Did I do okay?
It was okay.
Slightly longer. You're not so happy. Okay.
Could be better. Yes. So that's a challenge for the remaining speakers to see who does best in terms of timing. Based on the program, next up is Kosuke Shimizu from Yukoku University.
Thanks very much, Gülşah, and thanks for inviting this great project. I would like to thank also Pinat. Okay, I'll try to make it 7 minutes. My paper is about Buddhism and the question of international relations. It is a part of trilogy of Buddhism and international relations. The other two already appeared in Cambridge Review and Third World Quarterly. I'm trying to get some funding to make it open access, but I haven't got it yet. So just wait for a while. It's going to be free. And my argument is, as the title suggests, it is about relationality. And there are lots of studies on relationality in interrelations have been done. And I wanted to make another contribution to the literature of relationality. And Japan has been in a peculiar place. I'm not essentializing it. It's just happened to be there. It is, of course, a kind of periphery of in the cosmology or in the ontology of Western international relations, but also it is also on the periphery of China-centric world. And so Japan has developed a really interesting perception towards center as well as periphery through the history. It's a really long history. And so I tried to pick it up and reformulate it, put it into the context of contemporary international relations. And the key is Buddhism, I thought. Probably not many people might think that Japan is a Buddhist country, but actually the influence is really, really profound. And I found Buddhism is really interesting. And also there is a philosophical school, which is called Kyoto School Philosophy, which was based upon Buddhist philosophy. So I kind of adopted some of the ideas and then found out that the relationality they developed was peculiar and really interesting. And you can see a lot of relationality nowadays in the context of international relations. For example, constructivism, Jackson and Nixon, 1999, European Journal of International Relations. Probably that was the beginning. And GU developed Confucianism, relationality on the basis of Confucianism, of course. And in that case, probably I should introduce Jin of Chinese School of International Relations. And I'm sure that Tommy is going to introduce Andean cosmology and its relationality. I'm sure David is going to talk about it too. I really like it too. And Navneeta Behera developed relationality and cosmology on the basis of Dharma, of Hinduism. And then also, I spent a bit of a time in South Africa. I was really lucky. I was invited to Pretoria University and spent some time there and found Ubuntu so interesting. I know Karen knows a lot about Ubuntu. And so these relationality are more interesting to me. But at the same time, Buddhism, I try to add a new sort of understanding of relationality. It is spontaneous. It is not presupposed. It's just based upon contingency. So everything is contingent and everything is spontaneous. And if you adopt that relationality, the world appears to be completely different. It's an amazing experience actually I had. And even just living in this world is full of gratitude. You know, I'm so lucky that I'm here because everything is contingent. I could be someone else, but I'm me simply because I'm me. And this is based upon nothing. It is just happened. And once you adopted that idea, then I thought, try to find out the present, this moment, to be something generating, something new. It's moving. So adapting this relationality, then I found out some interesting events in international relations to reread these events through this new relational ideas. That's a attempt I made in this particular article. I took up Okinawa issue and also, Danish miracle that's happened during the war. And I was fascinated by this event. And I don't have much time to explain in detail, but I found it in Hannah Arendt's I, Human in Jerusalem. And I was so fascinated. I stayed a year in Copenhagen to study this particular issue. And I used Buddhist idea, Buddhist relationality to comprehend what happened in Denmark. And that's a second case study. And third case study was actually, it is a failure to grasp this particular moment in a case of comfort woman issue. And so you can reinterpret historical events by adopting new methodology. And in my case, that is Buddhist relationality. And you see a different view, different understanding, different comprehension, and different interpretation of historical events. And that would be something we can pursue in the near future in international relations too. Done on time?
Perfect. Thank you very much. Next up, it's David Blaney and Tamara Trounsel.
Thanks again to everyone involved in making this happen. Our paper is titled Recrafting IR by Worlding Multiply. This will be my speaking of the paper. I think if Tamara was doing the speaking, you might hear a slightly different paper. In this paper, we put less focus on the idea of global IR, especially if what that means is correcting the representational deficiency that concentrates IR scholarship in the Euro-American academies while excluding other voices. Our stated concern is to pluralize, decenter, or decolonize the discipline. In particular, we promote a recrafting of IR made possible through a shift in our ontological commitments to a deep rationality. Our concern here then is more with ontology than with epistemology, although I think those are always intertwined. In short, we advocate models, tools, practices, and sensibilities informed by a different set of metaphors that are rooted in existential assumptions of deep connectedness or relations. Units or things or entities are not given in advance, as in the usual IR textbook. Instead, ontological relationality begins by assuming interconnection as prior to the existence of entities. Entities don't exist, but by entanglements with others. Deeply relational worlds do not sustain the kinds of categorical distinctions or borders we assume between self and other, human and natural, life and death, present, past, and future. These lines of categorical difference are blurred. They exist only in constant exchange and complementarity. Through this lens or model, differences are always dynamic and subject to change. Our experiences, including consciousness of self, come to be only in such reciprocal and dynamic relationality. I recognize that all of that is pretty abstract, so I'll try to be a bit more specific about how a deeply relational IR would operate, or how we would world or craft worlds differently and in relation to the modern singular world that conventional IR now crafts. A key political motivation motivates us. Exclusive reliance on a modern, human-centered causal science is a radically failed experiment that threatens our health, our security, and our livelihood. Restoring our health and security, preserving our livelihood depends on being, doing, and thinking as a process of using our vital life forces in collaboration with the vital forces that accompany all being in the cosmos. We follow others in calling this a form of cosmopraxis. The time, space, landscape of a deeply relational IR is the cosmos. The human social world that we tend to isolate as our object of analysis is embedded and intersected by the non-human. Thus, we require more diverse and nimble repertoires of skills, including new concepts, models, and senses with which to engage the multiplicity of the cosmos. And this engagement is always along with and alongside all non-human other. For example, we might say that caribou are not simply a species to be managed according to our environmental understanding, but co-citizens of the cosmos with whom we must collaborate. We might say the same thing about streams and mountains and aquifers. A decolonial IR cosmopractice also sees how past and present, the living and the dead, are densely connected in ways that our modern notions of being, time, and causality don't allow. In Robbie Shilliam's terms, we are called to walk with the living knowledge traditions of colonized peoples. These knowledge traditions are deployed to rebind us to our ancestors and to heal the wounds of colonization. As Amaya Karajazu emphasizes, since colonial domination always exists in interaction and intertwined with other worlds, cosmopraxis necessarily involves a multi-dimensional diplomacy, the capacity to traverse multiple worlds in both the manifest and spiritual domain. We recognize that this way of speaking or being may produce existential anxieties or discomfort. For those of us, I would say all of us, who have been trained to center human language, to restrict human agents or to restrict agency and collaboration to humans and human collectivities, to place ourselves along the arrow of time, and to think of our discipline as secular, our world disenchanted. This call for radically new pedagogies and methods may produce anxieties, since it challenges our being as professionals and our understanding of the human in a human-centered world. We advocate confronting those anxieties by cultivating capacities for thinking, sensing, and living multidimensionally. This is more than simply becoming familiar with plural frameworks or paradigms and how to apply them, which is the extent to which most syllabi can reach, but to develop an actual existential agility in being, knowing, and doing multiply. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I didn't even have to put up my 1 minute sign, so thank you for that. Next up, we have Raul and Chiyu. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Pinar and Gulsa, for bringing this together. And thank you, Amya, as well, for bringing back the experiences of Goa so vividly. There are quite a few people here that were actually there at the time. Yeah. So my name is Israel Bunskoek, and I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher in the ERC Africa's Infrastructure Globalities project at the University of Bayreuth. And the paper I will present here today was written together with my co-author, Zhu Shi, who is also here and is a professor of political science at National Taiwan University in Taipei. Now, the paper is titled Community of Common Destiny as Post-Western Regionalism, Rethinking China's Belt and Road Initiative from a Confucian Perspective. Now, the article fits into the broader topic of this special issue in the sense that it offers an alternative, non-Eurocentric epistemological viewpoint to not only rethink the community of common destiny as propagated by Chinese political discourses, but also its practical extension in the shape of the Belt and Road Initiative. So therefore, it provincializes dominant Western discourses on the BRI based on mainstream IR theorizations, but without essentializing China. Now, the discourse of the community of common destiny for mankind was introduced by Chinese President Hu Jintao in 2012. It was then widely advocated by his successor Xi Jinping and written in the preface of the People's Republic of China's Constitution in 2018. The discourse perceives all the people in the world to belong to a future globally connected or related big family. Now, although the community of common destiny currently seems more like a myth, the Chinese authorities have used all occasions to appear serious about transforming this myth into a reality. And the main means of doing this is the Belt and Road Initiative, which Chinese President Xi Jinping introduced in late 2013, and of which the rationale is to connect the Asian, African, and European continents. So with the hope that this will bring together this so-called big family in the future. Now, what we do in short in this paper is to illustrate why and how this way of publicly framing the purpose of Chinese foreign policy has made sense to Xi Jinping and his colleagues. We do this through a reworlding of China by using the BRI as a case study to illustrate how in the discursive fields of China's elite, China as a Westphalian nation state and China as amorphous Tianxia under Confucianism coexist, struggle for recognition, and are interrelated. Consequently, we argue that China, because of the economic miracle it created domestically over the last few decades, is now convinced of its own moral superiority and ready to export its self-perceived benevolence abroad. So in this light, we read the BRI to be undergirded by a combination of both Western and Confucian values. And we suggest a post-Western, post-Chinese form of regionalism. Now, in a Confucian just world, morality leads to power rather than the other way around. So consequently, the emperor signifies a supreme moral being. His supreme morality is constituted by his selflessness and ability to self-restrain, which is embodied by his reign without governing. This makes his citizens naturally feel secure with him and look to him as a supreme moral example. From a Confucian perspective, self-restraining and selfless leadership should not speak to the populations of a specific scope, so not just to China, but to all. So China as a national category would otherwise be reduced to self-centrism and jeopardize its very being by becoming a definable target. And in a world in which the rise of national China has become the popular image, the only sensible approach to survival from the Confucian perspective is to exercise proper conduct and improvise gift-giving everywhere, including in distant lands, so that no such target of China can be possible. So wishfully, this would make China, it would become an approach or a system that would be emulated by all due to its supreme morality. Therefore, we argue that the BRI composes a metaphor of gift-giving or exemplification of China's developmental model to the rest of the world, and discusses the BRI to be in the nascent process of becoming a center in China's self-realization. Now, upon such an argument, we construct a post-Western regionalism framework. So first of all, while China as a nation triumphs primarily upon economic development, China as Tianxia obliges its agents to aim at selfless leadership and to help out the needy, as if together they share sensibilities of regionalism. Such regionalism can be substantiated by connectivity, through which localities can enrich themselves and be able to provide in their basic means of existence. Second, China as Tianxia cannot help but be inclusive. So the Belt and Road Initiative is an economic cooperation initiative, not a geopolitical or military alliance. That is something that Xi Jinping said at a recent seminar in Beijing. It is an open and inclusive process, and not about creating exclusive circles or a China club. In other words, this regionalism does without a definitive scope, but corresponds to the traditional idea of Tianxia, which is to show nothing left outside, so that all rulers of foreign lands could benefit. So even though it is not without much romanticism, the BRI and the Community of Common Destiny are respectively the material and discursive instruments for China to relate to the rest of the world. They assert a romantic form of regionalism. No borders, no general rules, and yet mutually beneficial, so win-win. In order to maintain China as Tianxia, its agents have to yield where the targets of relating show reluctance or regret, and remain patient where disinterest prevail for the time being. Selling the idea and the project of BRI too hard would appear self-centric. Rigidity in enforcing payment schedules indicates lack of self-restraint. Fluid and expensive regionalism, once aggressively pushed, would undermine Tianxia under these circumstances. In this light, European countries, for instance, can only become partners of BRI regionalism when they are ready. From a Chinese perspective, they are bound to relate eventually. China as a nation may fare badly in the world currently, due to its intense and competitive self-centrism. But China as Tianxia, without such a label, will continue to inspire people elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up, we have Neslihan and Minenur. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to start and then Neslihan will continue. So we would like to start by thanking our editors for letting us be a part of this very awesome special issue. And we also would like to thank to the audience for being with us today. So the title of our paper is The What, Who and Where of World Politics, two different conceptions of the international. So the starting point of the paper is based on the discussions in the literature, which is about the limitations of the discipline of international relations in its understanding of world and the place of non-core or non-West in this world politics. So relatedly, Eurocentrism or Western centricism are identified as causes initiating such limitations, which in fact prevent IR to become a truly global discipline. So within this discussion, we identify two bodies of scholarship, namely Third World IR scholarship and post-colonial IR scholarship. And we make this observation according to which these two separate bodies of scholarship, more often than not, are treated as if they are constituting a one single approach for addressing the limitations of IR. So we started to question whether this is the case, so whether it is possible to see different ways of understanding the limitations of IR or different ways of offering how to go beyond these limitations. So in order to give an answer to this question, what we offer is that what is the conception of the international in these two respective bodies of scholarship? We argue that focusing on the international is significant, as how this notion is understood inform the ways in which limitations of IR and the place of the non-core in world politics are made sense of. Then the question becomes how we can study the conceptions of the international in different scholarships, and for that we offer a framework, a noble framework, in which we divided the components, different components of the international into three, namely what of world politics, who of world politics, and where of world politics. So in the what question, we looked into the most fundamental dynamic shaping the world politics according to the scholars under consideration. In the who part, we looked at the actors whose acts shape world politics and what makes these actors as significant in world politics in the view of the two scholarships that I have just mentioned. Lastly, we looked at the location aspect and we frame it as where of world politics. And in here, what we look is that the location where world politics takes place and the boundaries between internal and external realm, which is very predominantly, prioritized by especially the mainstream accounts of the discipline. So this is the theoretical framework that we have worked upon. Now, Neslihan will continue with our findings and the implications of those findings for the global IR discussions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Minenur. In the paper, we found that the Third World IR scholarship presents a particular conception of the international as experienced in the Third World. So this conception is composed of identifying hierarchy shaped mainly by the material inequalities as the central dynamic of world politics, and core and non-core states as main actors, and interrelation between the internal and external realms as a location of world politics. So we argued that this conception actually enables the third world IR scholarship to develop a more comprehensive understanding of the international in the discipline, since they broaden the conception of the international in order to add the third world experiences. But while doing so, they also question universal relevance of mainstream assumptions to third world reality. However, we found that they do not question or integrate how particular experiences in the core parts of the world became universal assumptions in the discipline. So whereas when looking at the postcolonial IR scholarship, we see that they question how a particular understanding of the international has become dominant in IR by revealing what is left outside of the study of the international. Besides, postcolonial IR scholarship investigated the consequences of identifying anarchy, states, interstate relations as universal components of the international in terms of limiting our questions and understandings of identity, subjectivity, not only in the non-core parts of the world, but also reproducing power relationships in world politics as a whole. Especially the postcolonial IR scholarship pointed to the agency, the significance of the non-core agency. And despite the material inequalities, they said that non-core actors influenced world politics. And we see the give and takes between the core and non-core actors from the level of the everyday to the global. So to conclude, these two scholarships represented, or despite the treatment of these two scholarships as a single approach, our analysis indicated that they have differences in terms of pointing to the ways of overcoming the limitations of IR. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just as an announcement, I will be transferring my chair duties after this presentation. So just so you can all, I don't know, relax after I go, I guess. But last but not least is Karen Smith from Leiden University.
Thanks, Gülşah. I was hoping that you would have already exchanged chairs with Pinar by the time I came around, but anyway, here we are. Thanks again. You've received a lot of thanks, but I just want to add my thanks as well again to Gülşah and Pinar for firstly putting together this special issue and organizing today's event. So my paper is titled Challenging IR's Conceptual Constraints, the International and Everyday Life Across Borders in Southern Africa. And so for the purposes of my paper, I assume that the conceptual distinction between the international and the domestic, on the basis of which the field of IR really justifies its existence, is one which often has little or no relation to the lived experiences of ordinary people. And so I chose to actually explore how people engage with borders as an illustration, because borders are perhaps the most obvious places where the international is negotiated. They've become constitutive of our understandings of the international in a Westphalian system, signifying the juridical and territorial limits of sovereignty, and are therefore regarded as indicators of where the international begins and the domestic ends. And so what I did is I looked at two examples. The first is of the Chewa people of Malawi, Mozambique, and Zambia. And the second is the Kwanyamas of Namibia and Angola. And I should point out that, while I drew these examples deliberately from Africa, mainly based on the fact that African experiences have been particularly silenced and dismissed in the field of IR. I think it's obvious that these experiences are certainly not unique to the African continent. And one only needs to think of the case of Pakistan or the US-Mexican border, or the complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian border to see that these questions are universally relevant. So I'm not going to go into too much detail of the cases, but just by way of a little bit of background, the Chewa people are an ethnic group who live in 3 states, Malawi, Zambia, and Mozambique in Southern Africa. and whose experiences really blur our understandings of statehood, sovereignty, borders, and by implication, the international. They refer to themselves as belonging to a kingdom, and they regard themselves as one community. And they regularly cross borders to participate in important community events, such as marriages, funerals, inaugurations of chiefs. And so the perceptions that are shared by most Chewa people is that borders are largely meaningless as far as culturally expressing and identifying themselves. What I also found particularly interesting is that the 3 states in which the Chewa people live actually officially relax border controls to allow members of the Chewa community to cross between them for cultural practices. For example, Malawians and Mozambicans who travel to the annual ceremony in honor of the king in Zambia are not required to carry passports. And so it also seems that in order to remain relevant at the international level, the state implicates a demarcation of borders, but at the same time, to remain relevant at a local level, it actually relaxes formalities in order to respond to the needs of the community. And so this suggests to me that the strict conceptions of borders, state sovereignty, and the international that are assumed in IR are misplaced and unhelpful in trying to understand the ways in which the people and governments of this part of the world actually conduct their cross-border interactions. The second example I'll briefly mention is of the Kwanyamas of Angola and Namibia. And this case is slightly different to that of the Chewa, as the Kwanyamas live on the border, or what can be called the borderlands, meaning that their everyday life is much more affected by their proximity to the border. And they cross it regularly, sometimes on a daily basis, for the purposes of visiting relatives, shopping, exchange of cattle and crops, and attending school and church. And what I also found interesting was that the idea of the divided monarch is also representative of the cross-border nature of the people he or she represents, in the sense that the monarch is seen as both Angolan and Namibian. And so related to this is the belief that the last pre-colonial king, who died in 1917, has his head buried in Namibia and the rest of his body in southern Angola. And so while the Kwanyama are now also citizens of Angola and Namibia, this does not diminish their ethnic identity or loyalty to their queen. In their everyday life, the border is less of a marker between inside and outside, us and them, domestic and international, than simply a bureaucratic obstacle of little consequence. And so all this suggests to me a rather fluid experience and understanding of the way in which borders define territory, identify, and construct the international. In the process, they enable citizens, for example, in parts of Africa, to be engaged in activities that in the lexicon of IR would be considered international, but which they themselves do not necessarily perceive as such. So based on the assumption that borders are important signifiers of the distinction between inside and outside, by exploring how the Chewa and the Kwanyama encounter the borders of Malawi, Mozambique, Zambia, and Angola and Namibia, respectively, the international is shown to be to entail a constant or a complex and constant process of social reproduction, challenge, and negotiation. So in summary, what I tried to do in the paper is really to problematize this somewhat abstract notion of IR, of the international that we often come across in IR textbooks, and to ask what studying the way in which ordinary people encounter borders can tell us about the international or not. And so the cases, I think, illustrate that the lived experiences of people on the ground do not necessarily correspond with the conceptual constructions imposed on the world by IR scholars. In addition, they also suggest that the international operates simultaneously at different levels and in multiple ways, and is engaged and resistant through everyday practices. And I'll stop there. Thanks, Gülşah.
Okay, thank you, Karen. We're going to say bye to Gülşah, who's going to go and teach, and Amya, who's also leaving us. Thank you to both of you. Now, this second round, what we're going to do is we've shared two very short basic questions with the panel. So we're going to go in the same order and address them. But if our audience has questions for us, please share them, write them down in the chat box, and then we'll also make our best effort to try and answer those questions as well. Okay, so there's one question for me. If you keep the questions coming, we'll do our best to address them. I have myself in the as the first presenter, but if you let me, I'll go a little bit later so that I can collect the questions and then try and group them for you. The two questions that just so that I introduce them, the two questions that we've sent to our contributors. The first one is, what is global IR to you? That's the first question. What is global IR to you? And the second question was, what future directions of research would you like to see in international relations or global IR more specifically, right? What is global IR to you, and what future directions would you like to see? So if you go in the order of presentation, Kosuke is first. Is that okay, Kosuke? Yeah, okay. 3-4 minutes if you wish, or you can take shorter if there's another round of questions. It's entirely up to you.
Okay. I'm gonna start with thinking, if I'm to answer the question, what is global IR, then my standpoint might be a little bit different from other participants. But to me, to talk about international relations or global international relations is to answer the question of subjectivity and autonomous independent actor, and also to question borders. And it is in order to take seriously the question of subjectivity and autonomous actor, my approach is to introduce ideas of temporality and relationality. Basically, what I've been trying to do is to deny the existence of independent autonomous actor, and it is quite clear that all those narratives in international relations, whether that realism, constructivism, liberalism, or any of those, take autonomous individual or autonomous figure of autonomous individual is given, and that is something I'm really concerned about. And I might have a different opinion about recent China's move to rouse and Chiyu, but to me, it's the same thing. China, at least Chinese as a nation state, is now taking independence and an autonomous actor figure as given. And that is my understanding of contemporary East Asian international relations. And also, it might be a good idea to, and to the second question, what future directions of research would you like to see? Then, of course, denying actor or independence of subjectivity is one of the things. And in practical ways, I'm not subscribing to Acharya and Bazan's global IR literature, but in any case, we need to have some collaborative works with area studies people. And I've been having a discussion with regional studies, area studies people in Australia, and they make big complaints that IR people only see area studies as raw material providers. And to me, it is the other way around. IR can provide some methodology to area studies people that they can employ in understanding or analyzing area studies or some areas or regions. So in any case, we need to have some collaborative works with area studies people, and probably it is us to go over the boundary between area studies and international relations. We need to break down that wall in the first place, I think. Thanks.
Thank you, Kosuke. By the way, we have one question that asks, how do we as IR scholars, especially from the non-West, deal with our positionalities and entanglements to avoid reproducing the epistemic hierarchies or traps that we claim to contest? It's addressed to me, but please feel free to help me in answering this question as well. Okay, we've got David and Tamara next. Tamara says she'd also like to come in. So Tamara, would you like to go first? And then if David wants to all join in, please. Tamara.
Great, thank you so much. And because David did such a wonderful job in summarizing our argument, and I would say that yes, he did a great job putting into his words the argument. Here, I'm gonna go back and be a little bit more abstract in terms of answering your question. So what is global IR to me? And global IR to me is one that inculcates ontological competence. What do I mean by that? And I don't even bring the word epistemology in here. I understand that others have different understandings, but I feel like it's really important for us to get to the point, if we're dealing with these international interactions, and not just international, global interactions, we don't have to just break down the wall with area studies. We also have to break down the wall with religious studies or cosmologies, et cetera. I mean, this goes out to a cosmic level. I remember arguing for, when we had to do our, what is it called, research lines, I wanted to add the cosmic level, and they refused to allow me as an international relations scholar to put the cosmic in there. So that's one of the points that I think is really important, but what do I mean by this? I mean, it's not just, are we gonna become religious scholars? Are we gonna become area studies scholars? No. In fact, one of the things, and this is where I'd like to see IR research go, is that if we can start to make the connection with or between the product, meaning our actions, very much like how Raul and Chiyu did in terms of understanding this outlook and how you understand it, with a particular set of primordial existential assumptions, then that's going to allow you to make a clear connection, not just between IR as a school of research or as a discipline looking at the world outside, but understanding how we are co-participating in making this world. And this is one of the things that David ended with. And I think that we need to really look at not just actors outside, but also ourselves as scholars. How are we looking, understanding, engaging existence? And how does that impact the way in which we're reading it and then we're recreating it? Right. And this is not just a post-structural understanding. This is very much looking at how do we use our vital life force to act within the world. So in this sense, and this is one thing I just want to quickly clarify, this would not exclude, for example, the readings that are critical of relational traditions. Like Kosuke can continue to question the interesting aspects of Andean philosophy. Or, for example, Amya's great gender critique of Cotilla, or even just as Chiyu and Raul were talking about their critique of China and the notion of chancha. It would allow us, though, to more effectively engage across these worlds and allow for a more effective ontological translation. And what do I mean by that? That we're not necessarily reducing the world that we are engaging through this ontological reductionism that forces us to read the other as something that is necessarily reduced to our singular ontological lens and way in which we're understanding and grasping the world. And I think by creating that space, creating that complexity, and us becoming more competent in being able to use it or engage others, that hopefully will allow us to be a little bit more effective in not cutting everybody short. Anyway, thank you so much. And thank you for organizing this. I really appreciate it.
David, would you like to come in as well, or you're okay? Okay. Amya is gone. Now an extra few minutes for us. Raul and Chiyu, would you like to, either of you or both of you, answer these questions?
I think for me, I think of a parallel between what we've been talking about for the past two decades when we study globalization, about all the global has to be local. And I think there is a superficial parallel between this, all the global has to be local, and what we're doing here about global IR and regional IR. I think for globalization people, all the global have to be local so that the global will remain distinctive. by adapt to the local, but then the purpose is the global. But for us doing global IR here, we're trying to remain distinctive regional after encounter other regional cosmology. So we're not, the purpose is regional, is to reconstitute ourselves by relating to other regional cosmologies. So regional will remain distinctively regional, and the regional is the purpose. I think that's what why we're doing global IR here. So that's different from what we do with globalization, the purpose of which is global, not the local. So to that extent, I would define global IR as relating specified and unspecified others for all of us to know ourselves through relations with others in mutual terms. Therefore, it's not about participation and inclusion, but about non-inclusion while in relations. So I think global IR would allow us to understand ourselves a little differently than just concentrate on how different, how distinctive we are. If we can relate to each other through global IR, I think global IR is a method or process or practice of becoming related. And once becoming related, we know ourselves better because we know how we are different in a different ways. We compare with if we don't know what's going on outside there in the global IR. So for me, equality, participation are not relevant values for global IR. The important thing is to get related and reconstitute ourselves and allow us to be an instrument of others to reconstitute themselves. So we coexist and we are related, but then we remain different and distinctive. That's what I think to be the global IR. And I think we as scholars, the question is about the positionality of scholars. I think we as scholars are doing global IR together with those people we claim to be studying. We are reconstituting ourselves. We try to reconstitute our self-understanding by studying our subjects. So we are doing global IR while at the same time we're studying global IR. I think that's how I understand global IR.
Raul, would you like to add or give a different response?
It's always tough to go after Zhu. Such enlightening comments. But I do agree, though, with we coexist and are related, but we remain distinctive. And in that sense, I think it is kind of impossible to talk about a single way of doing global IR. And I think we should talk more about the multiple worlds that coexist and are interrelated and co-constitutive of each other, and also constantly change over time, which is actually in line with the broader argument that we made in this special issue, I would say. But to where I see the future directions of research, I would like to see more on how actual practices on the ground by actors, or actants in more like Latourian terminology, so just not just limited to humans, especially in non-Western contexts, are reconstituting epistemologies and ontologies. So in this light, I'm also working on like a postdoc working group project looking at epistemologies, and there we analyze the interrelated practices by African, Chinese, Western, and other actors in several like African countries, and how they are reshaping not only epistemologies on the ground, but also how these epistemologies then travel up to influence global governance and IR theorizations. So in a way, this is also how peripheral actors are constitutive of the international, as Pinar spoke about in her paper. So yeah, that is where I global IR and the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Raul. I'm going to turn to Minanur and Neslihan, but we've got a question here. Asks, is it possible to escape from potential relativism critiques for Buddhist-oriented international relations theories, right? And if so, how? It's addressed to Kosuke. I'll return to Kosuke, but I'm sure he'll appreciate your help in answering this question. So feel free to come in as well. So Minanur and Neslihan, either or both of you, would you like to respond?
Okay. I will respond to the first question, then Neslihan will continue with the second. Well, what is global IR to us? Well, our answer is a kind of a partial one. For us, there is a need for a constant engagement with power relations or relations of domination when we talk about global IR. So what we think is the necessity to politicize and hence problematize the production of knowledge with the global IR debates. In particular, given the increase of nationalism or right-wing politics in different parts of the world, including both the global north as well as the global south, one needs to be attentive to the utilization of local or authentic ideas and figures, which might foster or legitimize exclusionary politics. Put differently, sometimes there's a convergence between the discourses of certain politicians who insisted that their culture represent higher ideals on politics. So they underscore the need to protect and embrace local and national values, and academic narratives which celebrate intentionally or not such claims of uniqueness. But what we see in politics is that these ideas are sometimes translated into very harsh hierarchical or exclusionary practices. So that's the reason why we think that we need to focus on issues of power and relations of domination, which are informed by gender, race, and class. And these questions should be always central in thinking about globalizing IR. Thank you.
And for the future directions, further research, we think about do not limit our analysis to the North-South relationship, but extend it to the South-South relationship as well. So I think it can be, we'll be taking to South-South relations with a global IR insight. What we mean by the South-South relations are not limited to the Southern solidarity here, but also pointing to inequalities and hierarchies between the South and South. So this global IR insight could give us a perspective for understanding similarities and parallels, not the differences, between the North-South and South-South relations. So that we can question how hierarchies and inequalities characterize North-South relations, for example, the racial hierarchies, take various forms or hybrid forms within the South-South relations as well. So I think it is important to see the connections and the relations between power practices and power relations between different parts of the world. For looking at the South-South relations also brought out these new insights.
Okay, Neslihan, thank you. We have another question that's directed to all of us, so let me read that out. Do the speakers find the discussion about, quote, whether the calls for the unveiling of non-Western approaches arise from an analytical, methodological, in parentheses, scientific need, or a political, discursive, in parentheses, ideological claim, meaning for global IR, right? The distinction between analytical, methodological need versus political, discursive claim. And if so, how can we distinguish between the two? So that's for all of us. I'll turn to Karen now, and then turn to the rest of the panel. Please, Karen.
Thanks, Pinar. Yeah, I'll think more about that last question. My gut feeling is that it's both, but I'll hear what others have to say about that. So yeah, just in terms of what global IR or globalizing, I think, we're still struggling with these terms as well. What does it mean to me? For me, it really just means opening IR up to stories that don't have their origin in one place. And by place, I mean geography, but also culture, cosmology. And I mean, part of that is also, you know, just challenging the assumption that one worldview or one approach has the claim to universality. And so, you know, opening up, I always think in terms of stories. So, you know, opening it up to different stories also means different stories in terms of the subject matter, but in terms of the storytellers. So who are we listening to, but also ways of telling stories. You know, I'm so bored with kind of, you know, the usual way of doing things in IR, these endless academic articles and, you know, books. And I think there's so much scope for opening IR up in other ways as well, in the way in which we tell these different stories. So, and of course, you know, I'm not dismissing the challenges, some of which, you know, some of the others here have already referred to, and this constantly comes up, you know, in class discussions about this as well. But yes, but what about, you know, what about this, the power structures, you know, in academia and in the world, you know, what should we just give up now? And I think for me, you know, this quest, and it is a quest, globalizing IR means that we have to continue to be creative and experimental. And I love this, I wrote it down, this phrase that David Blaney mentioned earlier, we have to develop existential agility. I think that's such a great, you know, way of thinking about what it means to globalize IR. And then in terms of future directions, I mean, I want to be surprised. That's what I want. And I think, you know, if I just look at the work that students are doing, students who are drawing on their own experiences, but also their own passions, their own understandings of the world, that is where the interesting work is coming from. So, I mean, to any students that are listening, you know, don't be put off by people who tell you that you shouldn't write your thesis about, I don't know, if it's hip hop that you're interested in, or if it's some kind of sport that you're interested in. That's where you're going to get the interesting stories, right? Not just recreating, you know, the same old topics and issues in the same way that you've been reading about them for, I feel like in my case, for 100 years, maybe in your case for less time. But yeah, so I don't want to say what I want. I want to be surprised.
Karen wants to be surprised, maybe not at the moment, but eventually. We've got 3 questions. I think Tamara is ready to answer the very final question that we've got. And then I'm going to turn to Kosuke, and I'll also come in to answer these questions. So Tamara first, please.
I would just say that Karen did a good job of saying that it's both. I really shy away from either or logics that force me to pick one or the other as being the answer. I think one of the major points about this inquiring about relationality, or this inquiring into other ways of conceptualizing existence, is that that's when we start to realize that dividing things into either or situations is actually a fruit of a particular way of assuming existence, right? And so once we can start to see that connection, then we can start to think differently about how do we approach these. So yes, the answer is both, and it depends, and it's contingent. So that's it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Tamara. Kosuke, I can go first if you'd like to think a bit more, or if you're ready, I'll follow you.
Yeah, I'm pretty much ready.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for the questions. I better start with Ahmed's question about relativism. And this is a legitimate question, I'm sure. And I've been asked that question quite a few times too. And but relativism critic, or critic of relativism, is based upon an assumption that we need an order. And the question is, who is this order for? Every single order has some kind of centered figure. Therefore, I'm not interested in sort of providing a new hegemonic idea or anything like that. But relativizing is a political process to deconstruct or decenter a particular order, which is at the moment given in the form of West-centric term. And so to me, relativism or relativization is a methodology. It's not some kind of aim to achieve. And then I move on to the positionality question about epistemic hierarchy. It's the same thing. This is not something we should achieve. We need to, you know, I'm not arguing that we need to utilize our positionality to have a better world or anything like that. but it is more about decentering the narratives of international by using different perceptions, different ways of approaching to the world. That is something we needed, and definitely we should deconstruct ourselves if we feel regarded by someone else that what we are talking about should be the center of the world. Then we need to deconstruct ourselves. That's my answer.
Okay, thank you, Kosuke. Waiting for the rest of our contributors to weigh in. Let me try and give my responses to at least two of the questions. I'll start with the final one. I don't think it's both. I think this is a false distinction. Okay, I don't know who the quote is by, so I'm not going to pull any punches. You can tell me afterwards who the quote is from. It's in quotation marks. It's a false distinction if you look at the history of international relations. What we characterize as an analytical, methodological, scientific need is ordering the world in terms of racial hierarchies, if you read Robert Vitalis's work, for instance, right? The English School of International Relations is also located not only in an attempt to make sense of the world, but also relocate international relations in the post-war period at the end of empire, right? So this is a false distinction in the sense that there is always a relationship between the two, the analytical, methodological versus political discursive claims. There is this nice quote by E.T. Abraham. The advantage of sitting in front of your library is that you can look up quotes in a way you can't do in conference rooms, right? There is this nice quote by E.T. Abraham. He says, debates over science are never only about science, but almost always about something else, right? Debates about science are almost always about something else. I like this quote in the sense that it gives away our existing biases, be it political or otherwise, in the attempt as we attempt to make sense of world politics and then explain it to the others. I'm going to use this to jump on to the first question, right? How do we as IR scholars, especially from the non-West, deal with our own positionalities? Now, we're already one step ahead in the sense that we're very much aware of our positionalities, right? We do not start with the assumption that what we understand in terms of world politics is the ultimate understanding of world politics. So there is a slight advantage if that is your starting point. So thank you for this question. That isn't to say just being aware of your positionality is going to do the job for you, right? There's still more work to be done. But in that sense, I'm coming from a critical security studies background, so reflexivity does a lot of the job for me. And my thinking on this is it's important to not only be aware of the limitations in terms of the production of knowledge from Western Europe and North America, right? But also, also for the rest of us. That is why I have, from the very beginning, been critical of national or regional schools of international relations, because they have the potential to replicate the very problems that they're trying to address, right? So awareness first, reflexive second, but then reflexivity. Reflexivity here needs to be about not only addressing limitations or not only asking questions to others, but let me put it this way. It needs to be not only about asking questions to others, so what do you think, right? But also needs to be about looking at what the limitations of our own perspectives are. You can do this when you look at international relations from North America, from Turkey, from Iran, from Indonesia, etc. Right? So pluralism always needs to go together with reflexivity, not one or the other. Okay. I think that's enough from me. Anyone else who would like to come in, answer these questions, or
Could I add one thing?
Yes, please, Kosuke.
Positionality question is really interesting, but I'm not sure whether positionality stays the same for a long time in a essentialized manner. Positionality itself is pretty much a relational concept. Therefore, my understanding is positionality is more like temporal rather than essentialized, and we have to be careful about using that. Using the term positionality as something stay in a long term. It might be good start to think about relationality and subjectivity constitution. So ourselves, we always think that positionality, but positionality always quite a few times used in an essentialized manner. So we have to be careful, I think.
Okay, thank you, Kosuke. Anyone else would like to come in, ask another question, or give a different answer, or just for any comment? No? If there's nothing else, that I'm going to close. For those of us who are doing this early in the morning, they may need another cup of coffee. For those of us who are doing this late at night, they may need to go to bed now. For the rest of us, I think it's the end of business. So thank you to all of you for your contributions. The special issue, I've already shared the link with you. The journal is going to accept articles in English, all in English by the end of 21 onwards. So if you're interested in getting published in the journal International Relations, please do so. The website is both in English and in Turkish. Mustafa Hocam, would you like to say anything about that in terms of inviting contributions to the journal or not?
Yes, of course. We are always happy to see good papers. This issue was a classical example. The journal put an emphasis on conceptual frameworks, articles that are good and have strength on conceptual frameworks and theoretical ground. So we don't like to have narratives just explaining things to us, but we need papers with a very strong theoretical structure. So if you have anything written, any aspect of international relations, we'll be happy to consider, and we encourage new research methods also. So let me stop there.
Okay, thank you, Hocam. And remember, Karen Smith wants to be surprised. So keep that in mind as well. We'll send it out to her as reviewer. Okay, thank you and for your contributions, and hope to stay in touch. If we manage to put the recording online, I'll share that with you as well. Okay, thank you.